tonight is a person very well known to the British Institute and Florence, Jason Arkles, excuse me, a working sculptor and art historian who's lived in Florence and worked in Florence for over 20 years. As a sculptor, he has the rare distinction of having a large marble figure on public view in Florence on the facade of St. Mark's Church on Via Maggio, just around the corner. We are also, Simon points out, the Institute is delighted to have one of his fine bronzes back in that dark corner over there of San Giovanni on display, a gift from John Honig, done by Jason, of course. Take a look at it, it's really lovely. In the dark, as a teacher, he runs his own studio on Lungarno Torrigiani, where he's been for 8 years, where he uses traditional techniques and is also a regular contributor to the Institute's History of Art courses. With that, over to you, Jason.
What's going on? Can people hear me all right? Everybody else? My microphone is not on? It is on.
Would you like to use this?
I think it is on. It just needs to be a little bit closer, perhaps. Is that a little bit better? Yeah? Okay, good. All right. I have a loud voice anyway. I don't really need one. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I'm really delighted to be here, and especially delighted to see so many familiar faces, old friends and new. And I'm happy to discuss with you tonight the history of my favorite bridge in Florence, the Ponte Santa Trinita. I know that doesn't sound like a very exciting topic for a lecture. Might seem rather mundane, the history of a bridge. And for the vast majority of bridges, I suppose that their histories might well be mundane. But this bridge, the Ponte Santa Trinita, has been celebrated since it was built nearly 5 centuries ago as one of the most beautiful and graceful bridges ever built. And it has a history far beyond the simple details of its construction. The life of the Ponte Santa Trinita spans the centuries as well as spanning the Arno, and it connects us to the past as effectively as it connects us to the city center. So let's kick off our little discussion with a history of how Florentines have gotten from one side of the river to the other without getting their feet wet. So for most of the last 800 years, the center of Florence has been connected through 4 bridges. Now today we have 5. Ponte Amerigo Vespucci to the west of the city center was built just in the 1950s. But from the 13th to the 20th centuries, there were usually 4. And as we can see in this 15th century map of Florence, the Arno was spanned by 4 bridges corresponding roughly to the locations of 4 bridges that we have today: the Ponte alla Grazie, Ponte Vecchio, Ponte Santa Trinita, and Ponte alla Carraia. And of course, there have been a series of bridges spanning the Arno since the city was established back in the 1st century BC, with first concrete records mentioning a bridge dating to the time of Emperor Hadrian, 1st century AD. And for the first millennium of its life, Florence was small enough that a single bridge was all that was needed. Of course, that was built at the site of where the Ponte Vecchio is, sort of the narrowest spot on the river. And no one really knows how many bridges were built and then washed away by floods at this spot in the first 1,000 years of the history of Florence. But it wasn't until after the year 1218 that the Ponte Vecchio actually got its name. It became known as the Ponte Vecchio because in 1218 is when Florence received its second bridge, a wooden structure at the site of Ponte alla Carraia, and that was called the Ponte Nuovo. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. And then just a few decades after the Ponte Nuovo was built, a bridge was constructed at the site of present-day Ponte alla Grazie. Only it wasn't called that, it was called the Ponte Rubaconte, taking its name from the podesta, the leader of Florence, at the time who undertook its construction. And then finally, 15 years, just 15 years after the Rubicante was built, the Ponte Santa Trinita was constructed in 1252. So in the span of about 35 years, Florence goes from having one bridge to four. By the way, if you're silently sitting there judging me for my pronunciation of Ponte Santa Trinita, instead of saying that, instead of saying Ponte Santa Trinita, the correct pronunciation of the bridge, of the piazza, and of course of the church from which the bridge and the piazza get their name is Santa Trinita, which is the Latin pronunciation of the word Trinity, rather than Trinita, which is the Italian pronunciation. So a little bit of inside baseball there. If you want to impress, the locals call it Santa Trinita. Now, after 1252, we've got four bridges, but most of these bridges don't last for very long. Both Ponte Santa Trinita and Ponte Nuovo collapsed a few times over the next century due to floods, and at least actually once from too many pedestrians. And then one of the strongest floods ever to hit Florence happened in 1333, washing away every single bridge except the Rubicante, aka Ponte alla Grazia. So the rebuilding of the Ponte Vecchio, completed in 1345, that gives us the structure we know and love today. So the bridge of Ponte Vecchio in its current incarnation goes back to that time after the flood of 1333, built in 1345. Vasari says that the architect was Taddeo Gaddi, but there's some question about that. And so the Ponte Nuovo, Ponte alla Carraia, that was rebuilt also at this time. But the Ponte Santa Trinita, being the bridge sort of in between Ponte Vecchio and Ponte Nuovo, it was the bridge in the middle, so it was maybe a little bit less crucial to traffic. So it actually didn't get replaced fully until nearly a century later, finally happening in 1415. And then another flood came in 1557, destroying the Ponte Santa Trinita one more time. And once more it was rebuilt, but this time Florence got a little serious about the construction of this bridge, and it's really here where our story begins. So in terms of the arts, including the art of architecture, the year 1557, the year of that flood, puts us in the waning years of the High Renaissance and the early years of the first Mannerist period. And Michelangelo is living his last decade of his life in Rome. Then you've got the architect, the author, the painter, Giorgio Vasari. He is working on the second edition of his book, the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors, and architects. And finally, the Republic of Florence itself has actually fallen to the House of Medici. It is ruled over by its second duke at this point, Duke Cosimo, who in a few decades would become Tuscany's first Grand Duke, Cosimo I. So anyway, in the aftermath of this flood in 1557, plans were made almost immediately to rebuild the Ponte Santa Trinita, drawing on the talents of the best architects of the day. Of course, that's going to be Michelangelo. And we actually have communication between Giorgio Vasari, who was in Rome, communicating with Duke Cosimo. And in a letter, he states, "I have been seeing Michelangelo every day, worked on the designs for the Ponte Santa Trinita. Michelangelo talked at length about it, bring back a report of his writings and his designs, which he made of the actual measurements of the bridge." Sadly, that's about all we have from Michelangelo concerning his involvement in the design of the new bridge. Michelangelo died 3 years before construction of the new bridge even started. Ultimately, the artist and architect who can really take credit for the construction and design of the bridge is Bartolomeo Amanati. He was born just outside of Florence in Settignano, and he apprenticed to the sculptor Baccio Bandinelli. And Amanati spent basically the first half of his career outside of Florence in Venice, Padua, finally Rome, settling there in 1550. And that's where he meets his Florentine fellow Florentines, Michelangelo, Giorgio Vasari. It was Giorgio Vasari who actually got Amanati work in Rome at the court of Pope Julius III. And it's from this time that Amanati turns his hand more to architecture than sculpture, and he's working at the Pope's villa, the Villa Giulia. But then in 1555, 2 years before the flood, the Pope died. And at the urging of Vasari, the 44-year-old Amanati comes to Florence to work for the court of Duke Cosimo. And his first work is a rather impressive fountain, a fountain which was destined actually to be placed inside the Palazzo Vecchio in the Sala Grande. Here we have remnants of it. You might be familiar with it. Instead of being installed in the Palazzo Vecchio, it was installed finally, eventually, in the Garden Pratolino. Cosimo's son did that, but eventually it was dismantled from there, and pieces came to rest at the Bargello Museum eventually, where you can see it today. But on top of this commission, which he received pretty soon after arriving in Florence, in 1559, Amanati won a competition amongst the sculptors of Florence to be the successor of Baccio Bandinelli, who had recently died. Bandinelli had begun a large fountain to go in Piazza Signoria, and Amanati took up the fountain where Bandinelli left off, and today, of course, we know that fountain very well. It's the Neptune fountain. Now, Amanati's victory in this competition against all the other sculptors in Florence pretty much cemented his place in Florence as the preferred sculptor of Duke Cosimo in the absence of Michelangelo. In winning the competition, he beat out Vincenzo Dante, he beat out Benvenuto Cellini, he even beat out the young Giambologna. But of course, to be fair, Giambologna was a young and untested foreigner at the time, freshly arrived to Florence in 1552, hadn't previously worked for a pope the way Amanati had. And so when an architect was needed for the new bridge to be built, Cosimo picked Amanati, natural choice. Now, as I mentioned, Michelangelo, the aging Michelangelo, was consulted, and he evidently made plans for the Ponte Santa Trinita, the nature of which is unknown today. However, we can detect some possible influence, direct or indirect, that Michelangelo may have had over Amanati's bridge. Let's take a look at the bridge itself. Talk about what makes this bridge worthy of a lecture. So throughout its history, since Amanati built it, this current incarnation of the Ponte Santa Trinita has been described as one of the most beautiful and elegant bridges in Europe. This bridge is, of the four that are in the city, the most beautiful, the most artful, and more robust than any other, from a tour guide in 1677. Another quote is, "Many bridges have been built everywhere with daring and great skill, but this one by Amanati will always remain a model of beauty, elegance, and resistance." And that's from 1875. Now, many who have commented on the bridge over the years single out the arches of the bridge in particular. From a guidebook in 1850, we have, this is one of the most famous bridges in Italy and is considered as one of the masterpieces in architecture, mainly for the arches, which give it a surprising lightness. Another quote, "Besides the purity and the philosophical sobriety of the ornaments that can be seen there, its arches were carried out with such elegant and harmonious curves that it enraptures and excites the soul and the intellect." Right? So the surprising lightness of the arches of the Ponte Santa Trinita, right? The elegant, harmonious arches. These arches seem to captivate. And indeed, the arches are what makes this bridge special. By most accounts, it is the oldest elliptical bridge in the world. Notice I put elliptical in scare quotes, right? And I'll explain why in a moment. What does it mean to have an elliptical arch? Why is that special? Well, we can begin to understand if we contrast the Ponte Trinita to the other beautiful and famous bridge in Florence, the Ponte Vecchio. And the Ponte Vecchio stands out amongst bridges all over the world for several reasons. But the arches spanning the river between the pylons on the bridge, that's not one of the reasons it's special, right? Basically, as we can see here, this big circle, the arches take their curve directly from a section of the diameter of a circle, right? It's just an arc drawn with a simple radius. And this method of arch construction for bridges is absolutely standard, if not completely ubiquitous. But if we try to impose a circular arc on the arches of Ponte Santa Trinita, we see a lot of air underneath, right? It's impossible to impose a circle on it. The arch is flatter in the center, and the curves on the sides are sort of this smooth progressive curve on either extremity. And so this arch is not circular, but elliptical. Now, when we see a circular arch, like on the Ponte Vecchio, supporting a structure, we intuit a sense of form following function, right? We get the sense that the arch is doing its important job of supporting the load it carries above it and diverting downward thrust of weight to the pylons supporting the arches. But with elliptical arches, such as we see on the Ponte Trinita, there is a visual springiness to the line of the arch. And it gives us a sense that the weight being carried above hardly impacts the arch at all, right? The arch isn't compacted into regularity and stability like in a circular arch. And it gives a sense that the load it carries is light enough practically to be an afterthought, right? The arch is primarily beautiful and only secondarily structural, at least to the eye. And it's certainly a milestone in the history of bridge architecture, but of course it was simply an idea whose time had come. The construction of ellipses is fairly simple and certainly well known long before Amanati. And how do you construct an ellipse? Look at that, graphics. So an ellipse is made starting with 2 points, right? From these 2 points, 2 lines are drawn which meet each other. You can think of them as line A and line B. And then we can use these lines to trace a shape around the 2 centers, with each line, line A and line B, growing and shrinking in order to do so. And the only rule is that some of the lengths of lines A and B need to be equal as it, one grows, the other shrinks proportionately, right? And there is an infinite number of ellipses with differing curves that can be created. You can alter the distance between the 2 points. You can alter the lengths of line A and B, all sorts of different things. And although it's said that Amanati seems to be the first to create a bridge using an ellipse, he wasn't the first to sort of approach ellipses in art and architecture in Florence. Actually, that was Michelangelo who introduced the ellipse into the vocabulary of Florentine architects and sculptors. In the 1520s, early 1530s, Michelangelo was hard at work. The new sacristy in the Church of San Lorenzo, serving as a funerary chapel for several members of the Medici family. And here we see the tomb of Giuliano Medici and his sarcophagus flanked by these 2 allegorical figures of night and day. And what gives this monument a great deal of motion or even suspense is the seemingly precarious placement of the allegorical figures on these curved bases. It almost feels like sculptures are in danger of sliding off. And those curved bases form an elliptical arch. Now we can say with certainty that Amanati knew this sculpture. He had more than a passing familiarity with it, of course. He created a work in his 20s, just a few years after Michelangelo fled Florence in 1534, which takes elements of pose and type from that very same allegory of night that we just saw. But Amanati had a much closer connection to Michelangelo's use of ellipses in his architecture, because in 1559, 2 years after the flood, when Michelangelo was living his last years in Rome, and right around the same time he was making plans for the Ponte Trinita, talking to Vasari about it, he also provided Duke Cosimo with detailed plans for a staircase. Staircase was to be installed as sort of the entrance to the library, housing the Medici collection of books and manuscripts at the Church of San Lorenzo, a library which Michelangelo himself had designed years before. And this very impressive, beautiful, famous, outsized staircase seems to sort of cascade out of the upper room to which it gives access. And the elliptical center steps just seemingly sort of spill out from in between the balustrades. Now, again, these designs were sent to Florence by Michelangelo in 1559, again, 2 years after the flood. Michelangelo did not oversee the construction, of course. He was in his 80s, never again returned to Florence. Instead, Duke Cosimo, getting these plans, put the construction of Michelangelo's stairs into the hands of Bartolomeo Amanati. So now one could theorize that Amanati built the Ponte Santa Trinita according to Michelangelo's design. That's design he perhaps made right at the time he was designing the staircase. Or it may be that Amanati's involvement in the Laurentian staircase led him to design the elliptical arches of the bridge himself, one way or the other, who knows, really. However, there is a slight issue here. You see the arches, as I've been alluding to, my little quotes there, the arches of the Ponte Santa Trinita are not ellipses. So although there are an infinite number of ellipses one can draw, there is no truly elliptical shape, which comes close to matching the arches of the Ponte Santa Trinita. You just can't do it the way an ellipse is normally drawn. This is about as close as I could get. And yeah, I'm just superimposing a graphic over a photo. It's not the most accurate way to do it, but I think it's clear that the discrepancy is great enough in these curves to demonstrate it's not really an ellipse. And of course, you don't have to take my word for it either. Other people have proven it through much more rigorous methods. But so what? Okay, so it's not a real ellipse. There are other ways to design an arch besides using circles and ellipses. There is, for instance, the cycloid arch, which is kind of one of my favorites, just fun. So cycloid arch, you can see it's produced by rolling a circle along a flat plane and having a point, a single point on the diameter of the circle trace an arc. And there's also epicycloids and hypocycloids, and they're produced in the same way, but instead of rolling a circle on a flat plane, you're rolling it on a convex or concave plane, and it gives you a different type of arch that are all in the same family. All these arches are known as roulette arches. And this isn't a geometry lecture, so please excuse this slight digression into cycloids. But what is interesting about this hypothesis that maybe Amanati used the cycloid or some version of it is what's interesting about it is who first actually described the cycloid, and he even gave the cycloid arc its name, and that was Galileo Galilei in 1599, just 30 years after the construction of the Ponte Santa Trinita. So arcs of this type, cycloid arcs, had been mentioned in writing before Galileo, but it was Galileo who really studied it in depth and actually gave this type of arc its name. And he later suggested in writing to one of his pupils that, you know, the cycloid arc, that would make a very graceful arc for bridges. And finally, it is indeed possible to construct I think it's a hypocycloid arc that comes very close somewhat to fit the arch of Amanati. However, the suggestion that Galileo made, to his student is actually quite telling. Galileo, of course, was familiar intimately with Amanati's bridge, but suggesting just 30 years after the bridge was complete that a cycloid would make a good arch for a bridge kind of implies that Galileo knew, or at least thought, that that was not the basis for Amanati's design. And indeed, it wasn't. We'll get to the bottom of the mystery of the arch a little bit later on. So after the bridge was completed in 1571, about 40 years after that, Ponte Santa Trinita receives its final touches in the form of beautiful, graceful statues, one at each corner of the bridge, all four erected in 1608, completed by various late Mannerist, Florentine Mannerist sculptors, three of whom were former pupils of John Bologna. Taddeo Landini was a pupil of Bernardo Buontalenti. And they represent the four seasons of the year. And these four seasons statues, as well as the cartouches above the arches of the bridge, were installed on the occasion of the wedding of Grand Duke Cosimo II to Maria Magdalena of Austria. Note the Capricorn, fantastic head there hanging over the arch. This is emblematic of the Medici Grand Dukes. So Bartolomeo Amanati's incarnation of the Ponte Santa Trinita endured for over 3 centuries of periodic flooding, easily beating the record of any other bridge that had been built at that site connecting Piazza Santa Trinita with Piazza Frescobaldi. However, destruction would come one more time to this span across the Arno, not by flood, but by fire. Explosions, to be more precise. So on the night of August 3rd, 1944, just before retreating from their occupation of Florence, the German army demolished the Ponte Santa Trinita, along with every other bridge except the Ponte Vecchio, in order to hinder the advance of Allied troops. Ponte Vecchio was spared, but made impassable by the destruction of buildings at each end of the bridge. Now, this image, by the way, is not a photo of that actual destruction. This is a photo of further demolishment of the ruins in order to construct a temporary wooden bridge on what remained of the pylons. And here we see that temporary wooden bridge, although it wasn't really that temporary. It was there for more than 10 years after the war ended, until the resurrection of the Ponte Santa Trinita began. And one of the reasons for the delay was the question as to how it should be done. You know, of course, it was practically unanimous that the bridge be restored as closely as possible to Amanati's design. That was never in question. And within a month of the bridge's destruction, with the end of the war still months away, everything that could be salvaged from the river, from the site, was collected, cataloged. Surveys were undertaken in order to better understand how the bridge had been initially constructed. And this preservation work was spearheaded by the architect Riccardo Gisolich and the architect Emilio Brazzi, who undertook the question of engineering. So two working together, sort of one doing the engineering, one doing preservation, restoration, and research. But despite everyone being in general agreement that Amanati's bridge should be erected and recreated, it took years to finalize exactly what that meant. You see, that the bridge should look identical to the original, not in question. But one of the issues facing the architects was that before the bridge had been destroyed, no one had precisely measured the arches of the bridge to determine what sort of arch they were and how exactly they were constructed. And there were other considerations too. For instance, should the bridge be constructed with materials that would strengthen it on the inside, you know, to meet the demands of modern vehicle traffic? Or should the structure be lightened by the use of modern materials like reinforced concrete? And so from the end of the war all the way, you know, well into the 1950s, proposal after proposal was submitted by various architects and were rejected one by one by the Committee of Public Works. And mostly the administration rejected plans which didn't make concessions to modern concerns, things like making the structure stronger and lighter using modern materials. And this met with some backlash. And a counter movement sprang up, giving strong voice to the need to build the Ponte Santa Trinita dov'era e com'era, where it was and as it was. Right? Several art historians and intellectuals, Bernard Berenson being one of them, asserted that the characteristic of a work of art also consists in its technique, which is not separate from its form. Amanati didn't use reinforced concrete, and so it was argued that such materials just had no place in the process of restoration. And another factor was the cost associated with the reconstruction of the bridge. Now, the government allocated, you know, a certain amount of funds for the reconstruction of a bridge at that site, right? Not necessarily covering the cost of a reconstruction of Amanati's bridge, right? And the money was seen as absolutely insufficient at the outset, even years before any plans had been accepted at all. But the debate about how the bridge should be restored grew heated, and as it grew heated, it gained international attention. And the Florentine antiquarian Luigi Bellini, together with Walfre Franchini, the president of the General Trade Union, they capitalized on the notoriety of this debate and created a commission for the bridge's reconstruction and actively campaigned and raised funds to cover the gap between what the government was willing to pay and what the reconstruction would eventually cost. Now, tellingly, Bellini, very smart guy, named his campaign Dov'era e Com'era, as it was and how it was, stating loud and clear that he was raising funds to construct a faithful copy of the bridge. However, the Ministry of Public Works insisted that structural reinforcement needed to be added and went so far as approving plans in 1252 and hiring a construction firm from Milan, signed a contract with them. But Luigi Bellini, holding the purse strings for the funds needed to get the work done, successfully was able to successfully block this attempt. And meanwhile, his committee commissioned a study, which eventually certified that the original structure, as Amanati designed it and built it, as far as they could tell, met or exceeded the demands of modern vehicle traffic. So slowly, the Ministry of Public Works relented, and gradually technical, structural design problems posed by having to recreate a bridge from fragments and photographs were finally overcome. And by 1954, they had an approved plan, and they started construction in 1956, more than a dozen years, about a dozen years after the bridge was blown up. Now, an important part of this final approved design was the discovery, after all these years, of the true nature of Amanati's arches. And at the end of the day, most experts agree that Amanati employed catenary arcs for the Ponte Trinita. Now, a catenary arc takes its name from the Latin word for chain, catena, just like in Italian, catena. And a catenary arc is formed by suspending a chain, right, from 2 points, or you could also use a very limp rope of sort of equal weight along its length. And any sort of curve it makes, that is a catenary arc. So that's a catenary arc, that's a catenary arc, everything in between, right? And it's a fairly popular way to construct an arc. For instance, the cupola of the Duomo is thought to have been designed as an inverted catenary arc. But here's the thing, and I'll have a little bit of a demonstration. Can we actually get some lights turned on quickly? I don't know where they are. If anyone knows where the lights are? Just because I want you to see this. I brought like visual aids and everything. It's too dark. Or can people see that? Can you see? That's all. I'll let the suspense build. Hi. Hi. Yeah, fantastic. Lucifer, bringer of light. Oh, well, I mean, Lucifer was an angel, technically. Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. I just needed to show the lovely audience my what I've spent minutes constructing. So here we have sort of a blown up plan of one of the arches of the Ponte Santa Trinita. Now, as you see, turn it upside down. We've got a little chain here. And if you suspend a chain from either end and match it up with the ends of the arch itself, you see that it comes nowhere close to creating the arch that Amanati designed. And finally, someone figured out just what was going on here. Watch this. So if I take an arch or a chain and not start it at either end of the arc, but start it in the center, like that, and then suspend the chain here, it matches it perfectly, and then you just flipped it, right? And now it's a party. Everyone see that? I heard the oohs and ahs, so I assume you did. Yeah, and so that's finally, after a lot of head scratching, how they figured out that Amanati design is arc. So now here, oh yeah, I need to. Oh yeah, we can turn the lights off, or I should say, one is capable of turning. I don't know why did she? Oh, is it here? I kind of don't want to touch anything. I don't want to like turn off the. Yeah, thank you, James. Thank you, thank you, thank you. James, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so what we're seeing here are clips from a very short 20-minute documentary made about the restoration of the bridge, which was shown at the Odeon here in Florence on the inaugural day of the reconstructed bridge, March 16th, 1958. And this film was thought to be lost for decades and was only rediscovered a few years ago and digitized and was actually shown once again at the Odeon in 2018. And I haven't been able to find a copy of the entire documentary, but there are short clips online. And you know, through the years of my living in Florence, I've always heard this story that the Ponte Santa Trinita was meticulously rebuilt, very painstakingly put back together, reassembled from the original stones, piece by piece. That's actually not quite true. Very little of the original facing the bridge made it back into the reconstruction. However, the new material, which makes up the bridge today, has an excellent provenance, being taken from the same quarry of Pietraforte stone from which the original bridge was built. And that quarry is located within the Boboli Gardens behind Palazzo Pitti. And this quarry was temporarily reopened specifically for this purpose. Now, the final touches of the Four Seasons statues and the cartouches were also restored and reinstalled, and the bridge was finally reopened, as I say, 16th of March, 1958. But if we look here at the final frame of this little clip, we see Pietro Francavilla's statue of springtime, La Primavera, missing her head. Sadly, it was not located in the rubble of the bridge. And at the time, her missing head was seen as sort of almost like a poetic tribute or a remembrance to the destruction of the Second World War. But at the same time, there was a rumor going around that started right at the end of the war and persisted that the head was not in fact destroyed, but rather stolen, either by a German soldier in retreat or later by an Allied soldier occupying Florence in the last months of the war. And by the reopening of this bridge, with the notoriety that it attracted with the reopening, this legend sort of gained in fervor and persisted to the point that it was just sort of self-evidently true. Someone stole the head. Everyone knows it. And it was right at this time that a rather enterprising salesman here in Florence, Giuseppe Fantacci, seized upon an idea that would capitalize on this popular legend and serve to promote Florence as it continued to rebuild, as well as promote his own company. And that company was the Parker Pen Company. Parker Pen Company, founded in the 19th century. Whoops, that's not the Parker Pen Company. I'm sorry. Let's try that. Parker Pen Company. There we go. So it was founded in Wisconsin in the 19th century and had grown to one of the largest and most successful pen companies in the world. It was credited with the invention of the ink cartridge for fountain pens, and they invented quick drying ink, which you can still buy under their brand name, Quink. And it was the favorite pen of presidents and so on, top selling fountain pen of all time. And they were one of the first worldwide brands of pen, and they had a branch store here in Florence on Via La Marmora, and it was run by Giuseppe Fantacci. Now, on a business trip to Wisconsin, lucky Fantacci, he convinced the president of the Parker Pen Company, Ken Parker, to launch a publicity campaign that was centered in Florence, but really had a worldwide audience. Kenneth Parker, the president himself, was a veteran of the Second World War and had enthusiastically toured Florence during his time overseas. And he had seen the destruction of the city firsthand. And so when Fantacci suggested sponsoring a worldwide campaign to find the missing head, La Primavera, complete with reward money, Parker said yes. Have you seen this woman? Wanted posters like this were printed in newspapers around the world and in dozens of languages. It created enough attention, actually, that newspapers wrote their own articles about this, about the history of the missing head and the theory that the head is somewhere far from Italy, perhaps sitting in the basement of a, unscrupulous veteran. And I'll read a little bit of the copy here, if you don't mind. It says, it describes the reconstruction of the bridge and then continues on like this. It says, the recently completed reconstruction has been heralded by the whole world as an artistic and engineering triumph. Only one detail mars its perfection. The statue of spring is headless, the many years of search failing to bring its head to light. All sorts of theories have been formulated regarding its whereabouts. However, the various leads pointing to its presence in Italy have all been carefully traced, and all have been proven to be false. This fact lends strength to the general belief that the head was removed from Florence immediately after the destruction of the Santa Trinita Bridge by some souvenir-seeking soldier. If this is the case, the head of spring could be anywhere in the world, and for this reason, the Parker Pen Company has offered the services of its worldwide organization so that the greatest number of people of all lands can be asked, have you seen this woman? And the Parker Pen Company offered a $3,000 reward, which in today's money is worth about 30,000 euros, not an insignificant sum. And many Florentines actually weren't entirely convinced that the head was stolen at all. And throughout that entire summer of 1958, you can see entire families down at the Arno poking sticks in the mud looking for the head. Kind of funny. The campaign did not succeed in discovering the head of Primavera, but the campaign had achieved a few of its goals, PR for the Parker Pen Company. But it did more than that. It put the plight of the treasures of Florence in the spotlight worldwide and into the minds of people around the world. And the search for the head was a recurring topic of conversation, much like the search for a missing submarine these days. But eventually, the publicity stunt ran its course. And in December of that same year, 1958, the president of the Parker Pen Company, Ken Parker, came to Florence, wrote a $3,000 check to the mayor of Florence, and that was given to charity. The head of Spring had not been found, but the stunt had served its purpose, and the Parker Pen Company felt that it had gotten its money's worth. The statue of Spring remained without a head until in October of 1961, 3 years later, a young dredge operator performing the periodic task of dredging the silt from the Arno where it tends to collect under the pylons of the bridge, scooped up the head of Spring with his dredging equipment. Young Timoteo Lucaroni, he was rewarded for his find by the city of Florence, not $3,000 American, but the sum of 500,000 Italian lira, worth today about 8,000 euros. Not bad for a day's work. And the final coda to this story of the Ponte Santa Trinita, of course, comes just 5 years after the restoration of the head of Primavera, when, on the morning of November 4th, 1966, the newly constructed bridge is put to the test by the greatest flood in Florence's recorded history. And Bartolomeo Amanati's bridge held strong without the need for reinforced concrete or modern engineering, as many had feared would be necessary to withstand such a force. And with any luck, it shall stand for centuries to come. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, that was terrific. I really enjoyed that. And I'm sure you'll have some questions. The Zoomers are there. I see. Great. We have 49 Zoomers listening in. I'm going to take advantage of this gelato piece of microphone here and ask you a question first. So I was intrigued. So it was sculptors who built bridges, not we engineers. Is that perhaps one of the reasons why they fell down so often?
Well, I mean, you can make that argument, absolutely. Yeah, so the profession of architect was still, I think, in the late 16th century, still evolving. Basically, even as as recently as the 13th, 14th, 15th century, if you were capable of design and sort of handling, large crews and all the logistics of something, basically, if you knew how to design something, you were an architect. For instance, Arnolfo di Cambio was the original architect of the Duomo. He started out as a sculptor and then slowly moved into architecture, just job by job, and eventually he's doing the Duomo. And then a few architects later down the line for the Duomo, the architect of the Duomo, or then it was known as Master of Works, but same idea, was none other than Giotto di Bandone, a painter. He was the architect of the Duomo. Did he ever build anything? No, he designed things and oversaw them and then put the hard part in the hands of people who knew what they were doing. And so how much engineering did Bartolomeo Amanati participate in? I mean, that's maybe anyone's guess, really.
But he probably did have people who were designing the structural part of it. He sort of.
Yeah, one would have to assume. Would have to assume. I'm sure he wasn't a lone wolf just designing and just handing off the plans to somebody.
Great. Well, let's open it up to questions. Maybe we can get some lights on. Would you? And Zoomers, I think you probably all know the way this works. You can.
Should I click on the?
There we go.
Here.
We'll take questions we'll take questions alternating between the room and Zoom if they come in, but just to remind Zoomers, you can, I guess there's a little raise your hand thing, or just unmute yourself when the time comes and we'll hear you, or you can do a chat. So I have a first question coming from the room. It looks like an architect. I think I know an architect who wants the microphone.
as the other half of this engineer-architect relationship, I would like to inform you that architects made their living by making things. They didn't just draw. The sculptors cut stone. The stone fell on somebody, they killed the sculptor. When the architect set a arch, the arch fell on somebody, they killed the architect. So the price was pretty high if you screwed around. And there really was no distinction at all between the early architects and engineers. They were the same. And today, the kids that come, I taught at Harvard. I had 2 kids from Italy come who were just out of high school. Those kids knew more about engineering than any of the architecture students there after 3.5 years.
Thank you so much. Okay, any other questions from the room? Yes. Oh, hi. Over you.
Hi. Jason, after they found the head, after it was found, how long after did they actually reinstate it, and how did they stick it onto the?
I don't know. I presume it's, as soon as possible, a matter of months, probably, need to be cleaned up just as everything else that went back on the bridge did. And it would have been cemented probably with a brass pin, sort of a standard sort of operation. Most of the marble statuary that you see out in the streets of Florence and even in the museums have at one time or another sort of come apart and then put back together with pins. Restorations are fairly straightforward thing, especially when it's just sort of one piece. But you can actually still see, if you go down to the bridge, you can see it's not too clean of a break. They had to have a pretty thick joint and sort of made up a little bit that's missing. Not too much though. Not too noticeable.
So another question
Okay.
here.
Thanks for the fantastic lecture, Jason. I was just interested to know about the base of the bridge, and if there was, does it start at a water line at the ground level, or is there foundations beneath that, and how deep do they go?
They go really deep, and there are foundations. There's evidence of wooden pilings that have been driven down there for earlier incarnations of the bridge, and that was one of the major concerns about the question of lightening and strengthening the bridge above the foundations. They didn't know the extent of damage, but apparently they solved that question. I don't know the details of how they solved that question, but the foundations were deemed to be sufficient, as evidenced by the existence of the bridge.
Take a quick question. And anything from the world of Zoom?
Yes, Jason?
Yeah.
That was so interesting, especially how they figured out what kind of curve it was, and it was intriguing that it was. And I was wondering if you make the curve that way from the center point, is it still considered catenary?
I don't know. I would not consider it catenary, but you could say that the Arkles was made by a catenary. It's made from catenary arcs. But no, technically, yeah, you shouldn't describe that arc as a catenary arc.
Okay.
The arch of the bridge is not a catenary arc, but it's made from catenaries.
And another question. Sorry? Another question in the room?
Jason, thank you for your wonderful lecture, as normal. Did they use the original foundations, or have to take the foundations sort of a fair way down to start again?
I don't think they took it much below the water line. There was some sort of below water. I've seen sort of photos of the process. I didn't really get into the technical specs of exactly the extent of the repairs that they had to do on the foundations themselves. But apparently it was not, in a very real sense, fundamental damage to the foundations. So I can't get any more specific than that.
There's some questions on the chat.
Oh, yes.
Can you read it? Can you read it? I don't know. Oh,
So-
thank you.
I see comments. Oh, here's a question. Do the stonemasons use any modern tools to shape the stones? If so, how hard to find people who knew how to use old methods? I can't speak with any certainty that they didn't use modern methods, but they certainly, there's actually a clip in the video that I showed of masons in the quarry in Bovely Gardens, and they are they're shaping it by hand, and it's actually far from a lost art. Most cathedrals in the UK, for instance, have a full-time crew of masons who are continually repairing and replacing stones, whether it's a stair tread or Gothic tracery for a rose window. That is a rare and rarefied skill, but certainly would have been, I think, pretty simple to come by in Florence. One can only need to look at the restoration of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. It's going to be Comer and Dover, I think, as well, as it was and how it was. And actually know several cathedral masons who did this sort of work. And yeah, it could easily have been done by hand. And it was the 1950s, so I don't know exactly what sort of technical equipment, power saws, maybe to cut, blocks a little bit more easily, maybe more modern quarrying methods, but I'm unsure.
So I see a couple more comments here. This one.
Comments, but they're not.
Well, there's another. Jason, do you know anything about?
Do you know anything about the drama of the blowing up the bridge by the Germans and Allied advance down via Maggio? Hi, Graham.
Nice to see you.
Nope, nothing specific. Only that there was drama, as any sort of destruction of a bridge in the advance of an army would be. But no, I didn't sort of go down that route too much, talking about or researching the events surrounding the blowing up the bridge, simply because 40-minute lecture, 500-year-old bridge. I wanted to sort of hit the highlights. I'm far from a bridge specialist.
You did pretty well.
Oh, thank you.
In the room, any more questions? Or I think there's another one here.
I answered that one.
Oh, you did. Okay. Did you want to read that one? Maybe it was
It's,
response to my comment.
yes, it's in 1400s, 1500s. Questions of architecture and engineering were defined, as I believe someone in the audience pointed out. Alberti had laid out the profession of architecture in De Re Edificatoria. Edificatoria. Did I get that right? Edificatoria. Yeah.
Great. Anything else from the Zoom world?
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you.
I was just going to slip one other personal comment in. It's a little bit gratuitous, but so I have the great pleasure of rowing underneath Santa Trinita quite a lot. In fact, did it this morning, and now we'll look at the sculpture the cartouches. Thank you, which I use as sort of markers going backwards. So you need to know where you are. And I line that up, and I will look at it with an entirely different eye now. And one final comment, in the condottieri, there's a photograph of some members of the condottieri taking some sort of credit for having retrieved the head. And maybe, I don't know whether the two accounts sort of merge or.
It's not. What was his name? Timoteo Lucaroni. He might have been a member of the Condottieri, but his day job was right.
Yeah, right. Good. Well, as Simon is wont to say, I think we're reaching a natural end, and it falls to me to thank you very much for a really interesting and completely enlightening talk. I have a whole new understanding what goes on there. And I'll never look at that arch the same way again, and say thank you very much.
Thank you. To everyone at home.